All right. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Yes, Kyle and I are both with Professional Transition Strategies. I joined PT. Also, we also go by PTS. I joined PTS a little over a year ago. Been working with PTS. I was an independent consultant for a couple of years and worked a lot with PTS, and then joined them full time about a year ago. Prior to that, my background in the dental industry goes back to 2000, all the way back to 2004. I was with a company called OrthoCAD that digitized study models at the time before intraoral scanners came out. And then for about 13 or 14 years, I was in cone beam X-ray sales. I was the national ICAT rep and got to know a lot of dentists, become really close friends with a lot of dentists through that. Just feel really blessed to have been able to help so many dentists out with such a good tool. With that, I'll hand it over to Kyle and let Kyle introduce himself.
Hey, folks, thanks again for taking the time with us tonight. Very much appreciate it. A little bit about myself. So I live in Colorado Springs with my beautiful wife and two kiddos. I just got done with a basketball practice just now, and it's great to be with y'all. I started my career in dentistry, kind of coming out of the institutional capital side. Very much thought I was going to go on board with a big investment bank and work in institutional capital. Saw the way they lived life, and it just wasn't interesting to me. And so I took a couple hundred interviews out of college and found this funny little world of dentistry. All these little entrepreneurs out there. Some of them knew what they were doing, some of them didn't. I was like, well, shoot, I can help them out if nothing else. And so I went on board with a company called Sullivan Shine at that point. Was building offices out in West Texas. Had a baby face. People weren't taking me very seriously, so I started to do contract work. So I do lease renegotiations, buy-sell agreements, essentially anything to, have folks take me seriously. And I was doing just horse trading, right? So I do all that work, and then they would buy, new equipment from me. By 2007, I was getting more calls for that type of contract work than anything else, and so I started up a company to focus on transitions and transactions in the dental space. And 17 years later and 550 transactions in, it has been a blast to do, sell side representation and making sure the doctors are leveraging the equity of their business very well. So, I very much want to welcome everybody tonight, and thank you very much for taking the time. But I guess, Ty, if you can go to the next slide, that'd be amazing. Kind of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to go through, I guess, kind of a continuation from part one. That continuation is going to be the fact that there's a lot of interesting ideas about DSOs that are out there, right? And some of them positive, some of them negative. And I think it's good to kind of, I guess, dissect that a little bit. Next thing is going to be like, who is behind DSOs? Like, why do they exist? Well, what is the point of them? And why is it that they're growing so fast and so rapidly in this space? Next thing is we're going to be learning a little bit about the different types of deals that can be considered from DSOs. And then finally, what is the best way to handle all of this information, right? So I think that's kind of the framework of today. Ty, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, DSO is a four-letter word to a lot of people, and it earned that right in many ways in the early days. The early days of DSOs were they would come in and they'd pay close to 100% of collections. They would completely take over the practice. You went from being an entrepreneur, owner of your practice, to basically just an employee. Everything was run by a playbook, by a very cookie cutter. So that's the perception that a lot of dentists have of DSOs today. But then private equity came into the game and changed everything, and figured out really quickly that dentists were a great investment. And they also figured out really quickly it's actually a thing. It's something called the happy doctor concept. They figured out, that a happy Dr. Smith produces, and a angry Dr. Smith doesn't produce so well. So, Kyle, anything you wanted to add there?
Completely. Yes. I mean, I can think back to, early in the days of DSOs, which is 2009. I sold a couple of really great practices out in West Texas. They were, I would consider them friends, and we sold them to a very well-known DSO at that point. If I say the way that it worked out, it was a dumpster fire. The doctors were ticked, they left. Staff was ticked, they left as well. DSO was mad at me. I put everybody together. And at that point, I said, you know what, I'm just never doing this anymore. I'm only going to do individual to individual transactions from here on out. And here's the thing about the way that never ends up working. You know, what I've found is going to be that I think DSOs are actually very similar to dentists. I think they're a reflection of dentistry. If you look at putting a really, really great clinician with a really terrible DSO, of course it's going to be a dumpster fire. That's not a good partnership. The opposite is also true. You put a terrible clinician with a really great DSO, equally as bad. You put a terrible DSO with a terrible clinician, well, that supposedly, I guess, kind of works out. It's maybe not the way that you want it to, but it does kind of work out. And then finally, if you can put a great clinician with a great DSO, well, I mean, you can really be cooking with gas in total. And I think that that's something the private equity groups found. And what they found is going to be there's different ways of structuring these types of deals that can be advantageous for both sides, right? So instead of just private equity being the winner on the backside, instead, if you end up sharing those winnings with your partners, it can be a much more symbiotic relationship in total. So really, that is, I guess, incentivized lots of things. Part of that is going to be the different types of deal structures that are offered. That is also incentivized the total multiples that are being paid. So the value of the practices have also escalated over time as well via competition and then also via these types of deal structures. So long story short, it puts doctors in a pretty advantageous position in total, just because there's different things that they can capitalize on now that 15 years ago just weren't really a possibility in total. Do you agree with that, Ty?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm amazed at all the options that doctors have now that they didn't have just a few years ago. With my background being cone beam sales, it was always I was trying to convince a doctor why he needed a cone beam over a 2D X-ray, and almost everyone has a cone beam now that's doing an implant or orthodontics. But way back in the day, it was real similar because I would ask doctors to have an open mind, and I'd say, well, you don't know what you don't know. So just have an open mind. And I would ask everyone on the call here who has a negative connotation to have the exact same mindset. And, that being said, Kyle, what do you think in your opinion, what are the most common misconceptions you've heard, from doctors that have these preconceived notions about DSO?
Honestly, I think that the biggest one, and I've heard of a lot, right? But I would say the biggest one is going to be that, they may know somebody, whether it's a classmate or a friend or something like that. And that friend is going to have a certain opinion about a DSO they may have started to work with, right? Sometimes that's a positive opinion and sometimes it's a negative opinion. But I think extrapolating that opinion to who you are is actually kind of a little bit of a flawed concept, right? Every patient is different, every doctor is different, there's different needs for all those different folks. And so in some ways, it can be a very negative misconception because, well, if that was one of those ones that was a dumpster fire, and those do exist, right? Well, then suddenly all DSOs are bad, right? You also hear the other side, which is like, well, this one went perfectly, right? Well, it might have not gone perfectly for you. Can they help you in the way that you need to be helped, right? So I think it's one of those things, expectations and reality, really, right? And in terms of the reality, I mean, the dental industry is consolidating, right? And so maybe Ty, you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're about 35% consolidated. It's every industry for 30 years, private equity has, gotten into different sectors. And for 30 years, it's pretty much a repeating pattern. 30 years ago, it was hospitals. Then 20 years ago, pharmacies consolidated. Then 10, 15 years ago, dermatology, veterinary, and dental started to consolidate. Well, there's 10 times as many dentists out there as there are dermatologists and vets. So there's less inventory in that sector. So those sectors are nearly consolidated. But so we've got a lot more inventory left in dental. And consider every sector like a bell curve, and we'll go over that in a minute. But like I said before, dentists, because of this consolidation, it's they have more options than they've had ever before in regards to exit strategies. Even if you're not ready to retire, the average age of our client last year was in their mid 40s, and there's actually over 375 DSOs that we work with, and we work with also over 2,000 private equity groups investing in dental.
Very true. Yeah. And I mean, in terms of, how that ends up working, the reason that so many private equity funds are interested in dentistry is that, it's notoriously hard to kill a dental practice, right? So back in the day, I remember hearing about the 5 Ds of killing a dental practice, and that's going to be death, diagnosis, divorce, drugs, and Ty.
Uh, Drugs and
I
disease,
can't remember. One way or the other. It's all of the bad things
disease,
that
I
can
think.
happen. What'd you say?
Disease.
Yeah, something like
Yeah,
that. And
yeah,
so,
yeah.
well, long story short, if you think about the things that'll kill a dental practice, banks love to lend to dental practice owners. And the reason being is that they get paid back 99.7% of the time. They only have a 0.3% default rate. And so if you think about private equity coming into that space and seeing that there's this really, really, really robust industry that is out there and very, very little failure rate in total, essentially, if you can put a lot of back office support behind these different doctors, then suddenly you can increase profit margins dramatically, right? And so what we found is there's tons of different groups out there and tons of different private equity groups that view dentistry as a hedge on the riskier investments. And so I guess whenever Ty was talking about the competition that it kind of equates to, what that means is going to be these different groups exist, and if you have so many funds, right? So the demand is really high and the supply isn't high enough, it pushes the price up, right? And so that's kind of where we are at this moment. And if I look at a PE fund. One of the funny things that we end up doing in our job is going to be we kind of teach private equity funds how to invest into dentistry. And one of those things that we end up talking about is going to be, the reason for the high rate of return for the different dental practices out there is going to be that really a dentist's job ends up being to try to convince their patients to continue to brush and floss. That really is kind of what it comes down to. And if they don't, well, they're going to have a cavity and they're going to need that filled. If they don't have that filled, well, they're probably going to need a crown. If they don't get the crown done, well, it's probably going to start hurting. They're going to need endo. Well, I guess you don't need to have endo. I guess you could pull your tooth, right? And then it kind of comes down to like how many people would have actually pulled out their own tooth with their own set of pliers. Very, very small amount of folks would end up doing that, right? And so there's this high recurring stream of income that ends up coming from that. And by the way, if that patient ever wants function back, well, they need implants, they need bridges. These are really high cost procedures, right? And so delayed treatment doesn't mean that there is not going to be treatment for that patient. It just means more treatment in the future, right? And so that's one of the reasons that they're very, very interested. And, whenever a private equity fund ends up looking at dentistry, they're going to be looking at dentistry in a couple of different ways. I guess one way they could do it is they could just go out and buy a single dental practice and then put all of these other dental practices around them, right? But that takes forever to do that, right? And the promise that an investor makes to his different group of investors is going to be, hey, I'm going to return your funds in 5 to 7 years. It's something like that. And so if you buy one practice and you try to put a whole bunch of practices around it, it's just going to take too long to do it. So essentially what each one of these groups are looking for is going to be kind of a startup, right? Or a jump start. And depending on the size of fund, they may be looking for 20 practices or 50 practices or 300 practices or 1,000 practices in order to purchase. Essentially what they can do there is they buy those practices and they're willing to pay a much higher price for them because not very many of those groups exist. And finally, they go around and add additional practices to that group. Eventually, they cost average themselves to a place that they feel really good about the return they're going to get. And then they sell that group to another private equity fund. And that private equity fund is going to be essentially playing the exact same game, which is going to be taking it from 100 to 300 practices or from 300 to 900 practices over a 3 to 5 year time horizon. That way, the private equity fund can give the money back to their investors that have entrusted it for them. So, and again, I guess, Ty, maybe that's a good place to go. I mean, often I end up hearing people talking about how, these transactions, do they really happen, right? That kind of thing. I'm sure you hear that as well.
Yeah, big misconception. People tend to view, oh, the equity I have in the group is worth nothing. Well, we've got over 100 comps where we can show you where it was worth quite a bit. As a matter of fact, a major DSO just had a recapitalization event last week. Two in the last 3 weeks have had recapitalization events, and literally hundreds of practices that Kyle and I have partnered with private equity backed groups have had a recapitalization event. And we're pretty bullish about the upcoming year as well. We think with interest rates going down and just an overall, climate, the climate is such that that there are going to be many more recapitalizations in the near future.
Yeah, well, and it kind of goes back to that concept that we talked about last week, which was going to be, consolidation curves, right? And consolidation curves, if you ever want to look it up, there's a great Harvard business article about it. And they talk a lot in there about how every single industry goes through a consolidation wave. It's not just in medicine, right? And if you look at where we are in that consolidation wave, it's just it becomes kind of a snowball rolling downhill in a way, right? So the more capital that is behind that snowball, right, the higher the likelihood and the higher the trajectory that it picks up pace. And as an eventuality, it will get to 60 to 70% consolidated, right? And just because we have, thousands of comps from thousands of different industries over the last 100 years. So, Ty, well, where do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was going to ask, I love your example, how you explain a leverage buyout, because a doctor might just be sitting here thinking, well, how does this money just grow on trees?
Right.
Why is there so much money coming in to dental? And I think if you could give your example on the leverage buyouts, that'll help a lot of doctors really grasp just why it's growing at the rate that it is.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, so whenever you think about, the high rate of return from these different DSO investments, it pretty much comes from three different ways. Way one is going to be just because there is scale, right? So if you just have one practice and one practitioner, the way that a bank is going to look at that is there's going to be a lot of key man risk in that investment. So that one practitioner owning that one practice, it's going to be really hard for a bank to lever up and give more money to a transaction, because what if that person gets in a mountain biking accident, right? Well, the bank's left holding the bag on the back end. The second way they end up increasing value is going to be in economies of scale. So that can be, as you have additional practices come on board, can you buy things less expensively, right? So whether that's going to be health insurance or dental supplies or different lab deals that you can get. Further, they can also help each other out, right? So if you have a group of practices together, there's a way of leveraging time there too, right? So if it's going to be like regional office management, right? Or if you have an entire marketing department, right, to service these doctors, that way each one of them isn't going out and doing that all on their own, right? So just economies of scale can be a really great way of increasing overall value too for all the stockholders. The final way is going to be by using debt, right? And so this is kind of, I think, what you were talking about, Ty, which is going to be a leveraged buyout. So all of these deals have both debt and equity components to them. The easiest way of thinking about it is this. Let's say you want to go out and buy $1 million home, right? I guess you have two choices. You can go out and give somebody $1 million and you get the home, right? Now you're out $1 million and you now own a home free and clear. That's great. No harm, no foul. The other way of doing it is by putting a mortgage on it. Most people decide to do it that way. And really, these deals happen to have mortgages on them, right? Now, let's say that you end up taking out a $750,000 mortgage and you put $250,000 towards the deal. Well, in that case, you now still own that house, right? Or you could own that practice, but you've only put $250,000 in, and now you have to service the debt going forward. Well, let's say you keep it over a 10-year time horizon, right? And let's say that $1 million home becomes $2 million, becomes worth 2 million. Well, in case number one, you've invested $1 million and you've gotten $2 million out, right? So you've made $1 million, right? And that's a 100% rate of return. That's pretty darn good. I think most people would be pretty happy with that. On the other side, you put $250,000 in to start out with, and you still have to service that debt over a 10-year time horizon, and that's going to be another $250,000 in servicing that debt. You still have $500,000 left over, after all that's said and done. So let's say that you still have a house that's worth $2 million, right? Well, that $2 million, as a for instance, so you have to pay off the $500,000 remaining on the debt, so, right? So you have $1.5 million remaining. Well, how much did you just make there? We still made $1 million, didn't you, right? But you only had to invest $500,000, which means your rate of return just doubled. And so essentially, by utilizing debt smartly, it allows for this type of growth too, right? And by the way, that doesn't even come into opportunity cost, right? If you only invested $250,000 to start out with, you could have invested $250,000 in another house, and then another house, and then in another house as well, right? And so it has a compounding factor as well. So I think those are the three ways that value is created within this world. Is that what you were asking for, Ty?
Yeah, absolutely. And that creates, with all this, becomes a bunch of different choices for the doctor. That's one of the things we wanted to chat about with all the doctors here is, think about what deal structure first, will familiarize you with all the deal structures that are out there. And then, you can kind of decide which one's best for you. The first one is just, doctor to doctor, 100% affiliation, just like it's been happening since the start of dentistry. You sell or you buy 100% of someone's practice. There's also a transaction called a Mercer acquisition, in which you would buy in at a percentage or you would sell off percentages of your practice, maybe a third a year, then another third, then another third, and retire in hopes to getting close to 100% of collections eventually. So those
Well,
are,
and really, Ty, if you think about it, that's just trading your equity for cash, right?
yeah.
And
Mm,
so, I mean, if you have a $1 million practice and you sell 100% of it to an individual, you might sell it for $800,000. To a DSO, maybe they give you a little bit of a difference, right? Maybe they give you $1 million for it. But long story short, you're trading in your equity for cash in total. Would you agree?
yeah, definitely. Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Um, and then the joint venture, it is just that. It is a joint venture. It's where partner with a DSO and you sell them. They maintain a majority stake in your practice. You get a minority stake, and what comes with that is you still get, say it's a 60-40 deal, you still get 40% of the profits that go along with that. And in most cases, those profits will be rising because now you're part of a big group where all the back office has been centralized. You have additional marketing, just all the benefits of buying power, all of that. So it stands to reason that profits rise. I know that, Kyle and I have many clients that in a joint venture scenario, ended up, doing better on a per year earnings basis post transaction than they did pre transaction. And then,
And can I give a quick
yeah,
analogy there?
sure.
So I think about this just like bringing on an individual partner, right? So if you decided that you wanted to bring on an individual dentist partner into the practice, well, they'd be buying into the practice, right, for a certain amount of money, and now you're splitting the net income that is left over with them, right? So if you had $200,000 in net income to start with, and you have a 50% partner come in, well, they're going to take 50%, you're going to take 50%, $100,000 a piece. Now, the cool part is that if you bring in that financial partner rather than an individual partner, that financial partner can increase the value of your practice in those three ways that we were talking about. And you get to be the beneficiary of that transaction just by going along with them, right? And so, yeah, you might not get as much from a net income distribution going forward, but you just increase the value of your practice dramatically just because you're now part of a bigger organization.
Yeah. And great point, Kyle. And then the next one's an equity role. Now, this is sometimes referred to as a holding company type of deal. So it's also, you actually sell 100% of your practice to a group, and in return, you get paid out in cash and equity in the group. So you have private stock, if you will, in the group. So imagine instead of owning 100% of your one practice, you might now own 1% of 100 practices. And those practices scaled with, again, all the duplicated services centralized, those 100 practices together are worth exponentially more than those 100 practices individually. It's 1 + 1 = 3. And that equity, on average, we've seen, really over the past many years, on average, that equity is going to have returns in the neighborhood of 3x every 3 years to 5x every 5 years. Kyle, do you have anything to add?
And it's dramatic, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that one of the things that people ask about is going to be, okay, well, if somebody is willing to come in and purchase my practice, and then I'm going to roll in to that, well, the amount that I'm getting day one does matter, right? And it can matter a lot, quite frankly. That can go towards retirement. It can go towards other investing that you might want to be doing, all those kind of things. And so we often are asked that, how is it that you might be able to increase that total amount that you can get day one? And there are a couple of ways of doing that. But remember how I talked about scale beforehand? You can take advantage of scale concepts here as well. So there's these ideas of roll-ups, right? And so instead of going out to market as a single practice, if there are a lot of ties between maybe a group of practices, call it, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, well, then suddenly that in and of itself can be more valuable because now the private equity fund doesn't have to take the time to go out and buy 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 practices. They can do it as one transaction. And so it can be a lot quicker, right? You do lose a little bit of your autonomy from a decision-making standpoint. Everybody has to agree to do these things, but you can also cash out more day one as well. And you can use roll-up concepts both in joint venture and equity roll concepts as well. The next thing you can do is going to be what's called a sub-DSO. Sub-DSO is a little bit of a hybrid concept to the equity roll and to the joint venture. For instance, let's say that there is a DSO that is out there, and maybe they operate in, 20 states. And there is groups of practices that are underneath them. And they might have an organization that works more specifically in Florida, another one that works more specifically in North Carolina, another one that might work in West Virginia. Well, it's possible that instead of rolling up to a holding company where you own 1% of all of those different groups, what if you just rolled up to more of the geographically central area? So for instance, Florida has been growing like crazy. Texas has as well, right? So what if you rolled up to a group that ended up having, a higher growth trajectory just because you are more geographically central underneath this umbrella, right? So that can be one reason to consider that as well. The final way of doing this is going to be doing a direct to private equity deal. Now, you kind of have to have a lot of scale in order to do that, right? Again, private equity, if they have, a $100 million fund or a $500 million fund, the chances that they're willing to invest in a single practice doing $1 million or $2 million or $4 million in revenue on a year-to-year basis is pretty small, right? But what if you already had, 5 locations and $10 million in revenue and $2.5 million in EBITDA? Well, now suddenly there's going to be private equity funds that are going to be interested in using that as their jumping off point to create 30 practices from where you can bring them to market as well. If we think about maybe where we spend most of our time, Ty, which is going to be talking with doctors about which type of deal ends up being best for them. Maybe you can give a couple of examples of the why behind the advice that we give.
Yeah, there are also deals out there that are a combination of joint venture and equity roles as well. But I would say in general, the joint venture model is really popular for doctors that still want to work, 15 or 20 years because it allows them, in some cases, a little higher take-home pay because they're getting that percentage of profits on top of their fair doctor wage. I would say the majority of the people we work with are have 5, 10, 15 years left. But, we've also worked with, a number of people who want to hang it up pretty quickly. And in that case, just about every time it ends up being a doctor to doctor sale. But, that leads me to the question, Kyle, of, just speaking to what I'm guessing are most of the webinar attendees here. I'm a guy that has a nice, healthy practice. How do I know what's kind of the baseline that I would, that I can, where does my practice need to be in terms of revenue and profit in order for guys like us to be able to put them in a competitive situation and create multiple offers from DSOs for their practice?
Sure. I'm definitely not sidestepping your question whenever I say this, but location definitely matters, right? And so lots of times we end up thinking about these things in order to put you in a really competitive spot where people can lever up to get your attention. The recruitability to the area definitely matters because they know that they're only going to be able to have a certain amount of time with you. Whenever I say they, the DSO or the group is only going to have a certain amount of time with you. And what they want to make sure of is that they can find somebody else to replace the production at some point in the future. Now that may be 10 years off, right? But let's say that, that same mountain biking example ended up happening, right? Well, then they need to be able to backfill, right? And so if you end up being in a more rural environment, then typically it's going to take a larger practice in total in order for a group to be willing to take the risk on it, or having associates backfill, right? Or having a really, really, really great hygiene program, or else these different types of things. But long story short, if I look at like general rules of thumb, right? Just like we used to think about like how do you value a dental practice? 75 to 80% of revenue, right? To individuals. I think general rule of thumb is going to be, if you have something like $250 to $300,000 in profitability, then suddenly that does make a more profound type of transaction in total. Whenever we say EBITDA, right? So that profitability, that the total amount of EBITDA within the practice, EBITDA is just a finance term. It's an acronym, and it stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. Just a fancy way of talking about net profit. So what it wants to know is going to be how much is left over after all of the expenses are paid out of the practice, including a fair doctor's salary to do the work. Easiest way of thinking about it is this. You take off your doctor hat for a second, put on your investor hat. Let's say that you own a practice, but you no longer want to practice dentistry within it. Well, in that case, you'd have to hire an associate to do the work that you're currently doing. And you'd have to pay them a fair wage, right? Because they're not going to do it for free. And so the EBITDA is going to be the total amount that's left over after all of those expenses are paid, including that fair doctor's wage to do the work that you're currently doing out of the practice. So if we break it back down to revenue, it's like, well, you're probably going to need something like $1 million or $1.5 million in revenue in order to transact in a really profound way. That doesn't mean that the practice doesn't have value if it doesn't hit those criteria by any stretch of the imagination. I've worked with many, many practices over the course of time that don't hit those type of metrics, but I think that that is going to be a good indicator there. Does that answer your question, Ty?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of dentists get a bit confused because it's their CPA's job to build a good tax-friendly plan for them. And that can be very confusing talking to your CPA and then getting your practice evaluated, because EBITDA is very different from, if they have a good CPA, they might, for tax purposes, they're W-2ing, of course, legally a lower amount than they're making. So all that is taken into consideration in EBITDA, and it can be really confusing. And that's why, we recommend that you have someone like us get with you and consult you on the real value of your practice.
Completely. Yep, definitely. And really, whenever I think about all of those different types of deal structures before, all of them bring in the idea of equity arbitrage. Now, equity arbitrage may sound like a fancy term, but really what it is, do you know what? I'll give an analogy here, right? Let's say that you consider your practice like Apple stock. Apple stock is great. It grows really nicely. It provides a very nice dividend for whoever holds it. Most people are pretty happy that they own Apple stock in total. However, if you go to a financial planner and they say, oh my gosh, you own, half of your net worth or 75% of your net worth is in Apple stock, well, maybe you should start to diversify that a little bit. Now, what that diversification could look like from a financial planner perspective is maybe they put you in mutual funds. Mutual funds are great, right? They may not grow as fast as that single stock can grow, but it's a whole heck of a lot less risky in total. So now what happens during a consolidation wave, like what we've seen in dentistry over the last 15 years, is going to be that mutual fund, in this case, dental practices, they grows way faster than what an individual practice can grow because of those different factors that we were talking about beforehand. And so instead of just taking cash for your practice, right, which is the same way that it had been done for, call it 30 years beforehand, instead, what if you took a certain amount in cash, right? De-risk yourself some, and then you're able to take a certain amount of your equity, and instead of just owning it at your dental practice, what if you did roll it into a joint venture or an equity roll or a sub DSO? Well, in that case, that equity roll that you've just done has a much higher propensity to grow much faster than what it could have otherwise. So, I mean, essentially what that means is going to be that, instead of just taking the 100% off the table, if you have a certain amount in an arbitrage environment, it can way outpace the value of your net income distributions that you could have gotten in the interim. So, I think that all of these things definitely affect equity arbitrage. So this is the shared service and the debt leverage, right? Same store sales growth, all of these different things you become the beneficiary of rather than just kind of holding what I would call an annuity. My grandparents had annuities, right? There's different reasons to have annuities in total, but really, if you think about the way dental practices end up working, it is kind of like an annuity in total, right? You do a whole bunch of work throughout the year and it just kind of spins off a certain amount for you, kind of depending on the size of practice that you have, all those kind of things. Well, instead of just having that annuity, if you reinvested it back into a kind of a growth vehicle, again, it can be a very, very profound transaction in total. And I mean, Ty, I'm sure you can think of, clients that we've worked with that have had that happen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a lot of fun for me with the client trying to figure out just exactly what their best path is. And, depending on where they are in their career, sometimes it can be right on the fence, hey, here's where we think you're going to go. And we do a comparison of, you want to work this many more years. Here's what that looks like versus what it could look like. And, and we're not telling them to do a deal every time. We're actually not telling them to do a deal anytime. What I love doing is just being impartial and giving them great info so that they can make an informed decision about, their biggest asset, which is their dental practice.
Completely agree. And maybe, can I share an example of one that I've seen? Yeah, so I can think back. I was called into a practice in North Texas in Allen. Two brothers who own that practice, and then another partner, so 33% partners across the board. I was called in by the oldest partner. That oldest partner wanted to retire, right? And they were looking for the exit strategy where they could sell that 33% of their business. They had a really nice business, right? It was doing something like $3.8 million in top line revenue, which is great. Really high profit margins. I think they were doing roundabouts $1 million in EBITDA in total. And if I look at how much I could have sold that one individual's portion of the practice for, I don't know, maybe I was on the high side and I could have gotten something like 1.3 million, which is like dollar on dollar revenue. That's really not bad selling it to an individual in total. But there was a lot of things that a bank would have liked about that. The fact that there were partners, right? The fact that they had 6 columns of hygiene going all of the time, right? The fact that they owned the real estate. There's all these different things that they would have really, really liked about this deal. As I sat down and talked with them, we talked about the idea of like, okay, what if we end up considering different types of buyers? What would that do to the overall value? And we end up bringing in the other partners to have that discussion, right? It's like, okay, well, we all kind of need to understand either who this individual is that's going to be taking over this portion of the practice because they got to get along, right? Or who this financial partner is that they're going to be bringing in because we want to make sure it's the right one, the right reasons, right time, all that kind of stuff. Long story short, if I look at the total amount of value that was created, even on day one of the transaction, that third of the practice, instead of being worth $1.3 million, ended up being worth $2.9 million. Day one, right? They sold a 70% stake, kept a 30% stake. And that 30% stake that they decided to keep, they ended up having two transactions with different private equity funds after that. So they've had two recapitalization events since. So long story short, over the course of, this was about 5 years ago, over a 5 year time horizon, instead of him taking $1.3 million off of the table, what he ended up doing was going to be taking the $2.9 million, rolling $900,000 back in, and then watching that multiply over the course of a 5 year time horizon. And essentially what he got to do is he got to walk with right at, $4.5 million in total. That $4.5 million is obviously way more than the $1.3 million. But the cool thing is this: he also got to have his brother do it with him. He also got to have his partner do it with him. So all of them, instead of having a practice that was worth $3.8 million, they had a practice that was going to be worth over $13 million over that same 5 year time horizon. Again, some of these numbers can be very profound, and that's not a unicorn example. If anything, that's kind of on the low side of what we end up seeing.
Yeah, and I'll share an example actually from this year. Obviously, they haven't had a recapitalization event, but it was from this year, and we put the doctor in a good position from day one. This was a practice in a nice metropolitan area, about 1.5 million in collections. The doctor wanted to work about 5 more years, so he fit the bill for, most of these PE-backed groups would like a 5 year work back. Now, in the normal market selling that doctor to doctor, that doctor's going to get, 70 to 80% of collections. So let's call it 1.2 million is basically market rate for his practice. So we were able to market his practice. We got 8 different DSOs vying for partnership. And as a result, we were able to, leverage up all the offers, and we got the doctor, more cash at close than he did in collection, than he does in collections by a good amount. And on top of that, it was a holding company deal or an equity role, and his equity is estimated just by standard metrics to be worth about 6 million in 5 years. So, we turned a $1.2 million asset into a $7 or $8 million asset over that coincides with his retirement.
Yeah, it's pretty profound, and it's honestly one of the coolest things that we're able to be a part of, I think.
Yeah. So when is the best time to transition your practice? We've kind of been getting around that, but what most doctors do, the old school thought is before private equity came into the market was, well, I'm just going to work until I'm ready to retire, and then I'm going to figure it out, or I'm going to, bring in an associate and then I'll sell off to them. But most of the times you see the graph here, you get to your growth stage, then consistent collections, and most doctors wait to sell or partner when they're getting ready to retire. Well, ideally, you want to plan ahead at least 5 years in advance so that you can take advantage of the equity arbitrage that Kyle was talking about.
Yep. I think whenever we were talking about this last week, we were talking about beginning with the end in mind, right? That type of concept. And I'm a big believer that, you open up your options pretty dramatically whenever you do start thinking about these things. Because here's the cool part is like, if you're just thinking about it, that doesn't mean you need to do something, right? But if nothing else, it allows you to vet out all these different types of concepts. And I think you end up making a better decision that way as well. I can think of many times in my career that end up getting called by a doctor and it's like, I need to sell yesterday, right? Well, in that case, I kind of only have one option for you, right? And it's going to be, I'm going to sell your practice to an individual, and it's going to take a certain amount of time to find that individual. And if something detrimental has happened to that person in the interim, well, we're crashing the value. I remember that there was a guy that specialized in transactions back in the 1970s and 80s that used to be a mentor of mine, and he used to talk about how, if that does happen to a practice, you lose 1% of practice value every single day that you're not in the practice. And so that doesn't take very long for there not to be very much value left. And so, if I look at it from a risk perspective, again, if you're just wanting to mitigate risk, it's always better to start ahead of time, right? Because again, you always have the benefit of saying no at that point rather than forcing yourself to have to do something. Again, I just think it's a better protocol in total.
Yeah, and having your practice being your biggest asset, like I think I mentioned on the last webinar, envision treating your biggest asset like your financial portfolio. You probably don't have everything in Apple stock. A lot of doctors have never thought of their practice as actually, to leverage their practice as an investment vehicle. And that's out there for you. That's what, obviously what we've been talking about here for a few minutes now, but consider it your asset. And what I love doing is starting to talk with a doctor and asking them, if you could wave the proverbial magic wand from now until your retirement, tell me about that. What would it be? What would be the best outcome? And then we can cater a plan to get them the best outcome. And the best outcome might not always be the highest offer. It might be a work-life balance kind of thing. So there's just
Oh yeah.
these different factors that go into it.
Yep, I couldn't agree anymore. And then again, if you have more time, right, then you have more options. And maybe that's a good place to kind of pivot and talk about time, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I look at where we were as an industry 15 years ago, we were just single digit consolidated, right? And if you look at the trajectory over time with again 375 different DSOs that are out there. I think it's very, very safe to say that again, if you look at that, Harvard Business Review article of the consolidation curve, it's pretty easy to tell that we are kind of in the second half of this consolidation wave. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to do something. I'm not pining for that at all. If you just love exactly what it is that you're doing, quite frankly, you can stick your head in the sand. And I actually think that that is a viable way of thinking about this. I'm not being facetious there. If you decide to do that, then essentially you know what you're going to get, right? You're going to be working for the next few years, and it's going to be, an annuity over those years, and then you're going to end up having a cash for the asset that you're getting from an individual, right? And it's pretty formulaic. And by the way, I've sold a lot of practices that way, and nothing wrong with it at all. However, if we're looking at it from a consolidation wave perspective and that equity arbitrage piece that we were talking about, it's always better to be earlier in the equity arbitrage wave than later. And here's the reason is that you have more time for that equity to grow, right? So if you were to come to me in 7 years, as a for instance, and say, hey, how much equity arbitrage do we have possibly left, right? And how much of the industry is left to consolidate? I'm going to say, not very much, right? At that point, I think that the industry norms will have kind of come back down to what we had experienced 15 years ago. But we are kind of at a unique time, right? So over the last 5 years specifically, and probably over the next 2 or 3 years, we're in a pretty specific time that allows us to take advantage of the time required for that equity to grow and for the amount of practices in order to consolidate are still very robust. At some point or another, once we get to the 65, 70% range, there's just not enough really, really great practices out there to band together, right? And so at that point, we just kind of stagger right along that amount, right? Which ends up being somewhere between 65 and 70% on a year-to-year basis. Now, again, hopefully you don't take from here, fear, right? I'm not a big believer in making a decision out of fear. However, it's good to have knowledge, right? And if the knowledge is going to be that right now is going to be more advantageous than in a year or than in 2 years or than in 5 years, well, it's better to have the knowledge sooner rather than later, right? And so I think that's where, again, where you can end up making better decisions. Ty, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just we're at a point in the cycle in which every sector brings every different sector private equity goes to, it reaches what we call equilibrium. And we're I think Kyle and I both agree that we're definitely past the peak, but we're still near the peak. So we're still seeing high multiples and creating high competitive situations to get high multiples on practices. But we are a little, arguably, some people say we're a little more than halfway there. And when an industry reaches 65 to 70% consolidation, we'll reach that equilibrium, and private equity will take its bag of money, if you will, to the next sector.
Yeah, and I mean, Ty, so and maybe moving on to the next slide, like what will come when the industry is consolidated,
Yeah, I think I read an article that said I think it was the article that you did in Forbes. So I was wanting you to expand on that, what your predictions were, down the road, what is to come in, 10 years. What do you think the industry will look like?
Yeah. When I look, I think that there's going to be a wide range of things that the industry will be. I think there's definitely going to be groups that will be public at that point. I think there's going to be different groups out there that have kind of taken a non-for-profit type of approach, right? So like many hospital systems have. There's still going to be plenty of doctors out there that are practicing on their own, right? The industry is, call it 65 to 70% consolidated. That still means 30 or 35% of practices that are remaining. There's still going to be mom and pop dentistry going on as well, right? Just because McDonald's exists doesn't mean that all of the individual burger joints do not exist, right? There's still that existing as well. And so, however, I think it does become less advantageous to consider moving into that world, right? Here's what I mean. If you consider it now, whenever multiples are definitely higher than what they would have been otherwise, well, then suddenly the value of your practice initially is more, and the amount of your equity can grow to be more. If you end up thinking about it later, what the risk is that that brings in is going to be that the multiples are not going to be quite as high, and the amount of equity arbitrage that is out there is not going to be quite as robust. That doesn't mean that people won't consider doing it. There will still be a lot of mergers and acquisitions activity in that world, but it just means it's not going to be as much of a difference between those two different types of options in total. So again, I would say the earlier the better, and then testing the market is going to be an important concept as well.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting close to the end here. We'll have a Q&A now. Doctors, if you'd like to type your questions into the chat, we can field that. And yeah, that's we've pretty much reached the end of the presentation, and we hope it was informative. This one was to build on the last one. We talked about some of the same things, but we wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive on this one and just explain the potential of what you can do with a large dental practice these days. Because like I said before, you don't know what you don't know. So our goal here was to just inform you and, answer all your questions.
Yeah, so feel free to put any of the questions in the chat box. I see one coming in. So with inflation in the current economic state, have we seen valuations decrease? Why or why not? Ty, you go.
Yeah, I would say, well, I guess I would say yes and no, mostly no, just based on the results we've gotten. I would say some groups have focused more on organic growth rather than inorganic growth. So in other words, they've focused on creative ways for same store growth versus going and just acquiring as many practices as they did before. But we're still doing as many transitions as we've done before. I would say maybe what I've seen is maybe at the peak when I think, interest rates were really almost artificially at all-time lows. Where we might get 8 or 9 offers on a deal there, now we get 5 or 6. So in that regard, maybe slowed down to that extent, but we're already seeing an uptick, and not a political comment, but with the new administration coming in, I think we're going to see an uptick in M&A, mergers and acquisitions, this coming year.
Yeah, I would agree with that in total. I think that, if we look at, tracking the type of multiples and valuations that we end up seeing, there's very little difference year on year. But I think it's probably true that there have been some groups that have decided to, hit pause and focus on other things, right? Whether that's going to be, increasing profitability or, kind of working on their infrastructure of their group, those kind of things. And so it's kind of hard to put a price on those types of things, because if we're still getting multiples out there that are going to be requisite with the high times, well, it hasn't hurt it too much. I think part of that is going to be the resilience of dentistry in total. If you look at how dentistry performed in 2001, right? In 2008 and 2009, dentistry well, I think one of my favorite stats was going to be, the only profitable part of Bank of America during 2009 was their practice lending division, right? And if you look at the way the dentistry surged back from the pandemic, right? There's lots of things to like there. And of course, inflation has hurt lots of different industries, right? But overall, it seems to be very, very resilient in total. I guess I'm seeing another one come in. What characteristics are DSOs looking for to determine dental practices if a dental practice is worth investing in?
I would say, I mean, kind of the baseline based on, what you said earlier, it's, I would say around a million and a half in collections and around a 20% EBITDA margin. So a million and a half dollar practice with a 20% margin would be about 300 in EBITDA. While I was answering that, a question came in, saying a practice grossing 800,000 is not a candidate then for private equity sale, correct? Well, I mean, in general, I would say yes, but that being said, we will do a free practice evaluation for anyone on the call here. We service clients from $500,000 all the way up to, Kyle and I are both working on deals now that are in excess, that are nine figures. So everywhere in between. So in general, yeah, kind of the baseline is going to be a little north of a million with a 20% EBITDA margin. But if you don't have that big of a practice, we're still happy to help you out with evaluation. I would say about 15–20% of the business we do is doctor to doctor sales, and we have a pool of over 10,000 individual buyers. So just because you don't qualify for a private equity sale does not mean you don't have a great practice, and doesn't mean we can't help you out.
And by the way, so sometimes we get surprised on that kind of stuff as well, right? So in general, I think that comment is 100% correct. However, look, we brought a practice to market that was going to be, I think it's right at $780,000 in revenue. We thought this was going to be an individual transaction. As it turns out, there's now 3 DSOs bidding on it, right? So, sometimes that does happen. That's probably a little bit of an unusual result. That happens to be, in a very attractive college town, right? And so there's some benefits there. They also have, a 9-operatory facility, so you can grow something bigger inside of it as well. So more things have to match up on the back end in order for that to occur. So, but Ty, I think that you're generally correct there.
Yeah, and there could be a situation in which, a current partner doctor in the practice wants to expand and want a smaller practice instead of them building a de novo. A smaller practice might very well have an opportunity to be called what they call a tuck-in to a larger practice within the DSO. So never say no.
Yep. Good. Let's see here. I've heard that dentists often stay on with DSOs for 5 years after they sell to one. Is that always the case? Maybe explain some options that they have to maybe stop practicing sooner. Ty, can I give an example on this one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I can think of a practice that we worked with in the north suburbs of Chicago. This practice is doing right around $2.3 million in revenue, single provider. And their goal was to be completely and totally out as soon as possible. As we took the practice to market, what we found was going to be there are these 2 younger dentists. Both of them wanted to partner with the DSO, and they wanted to do a joint venture. So those 2 younger dentist partners ended up purchasing a 40% stake within the business. The DSO came in and purchased a 60% stake. That single owner was able to get out with all of their money essentially day one. It was 95% day one, and the final 5% in 90 days. So there are ways of doing that, right? So it's just kind of more unique style situations in total. And look, with 375 different DSOs that are out there, everybody has different protocols and different ideas on what it is that they want and where they are in their investment cycles, all those different types of things. So it's really hard to say that it's just like, it's just that, right? Again, in general, it's good to assume that that's the case, but I think there are variances there as well.
Yeah, I've got a good one here. I know we're coming up on the bottom of the hour at the end, but do you find a lowering of ethical standards after a private practice sells out to a corporate entity where the
Hmm.
bottom line is the bottom line? I worked for corporate dental offices and I felt pressure to produce crowns instead of fillings. Needless to say, I did not fit into their practice ethics. Excellent question.
Really good.
As I mentioned, well, there's two different kinds of groups out there. There's the activist groups. I'm guessing that you work for what we call an activist group. And then there's the aggregationist groups. Now, the aggregationist groups are often groups that are founded by doctors for doctors, and they've simply gotten a private equity investment to help them grow and spread their great dentistry across the fruited plain. So let's say that you and your buddy went to dental school and you practice the exact same way. We've got an example of this that turned into a DSO, actually. These guys had very similar philosophies. They built associate driven practices based on their philosophies. Good dentistry and focusing on the patient was at the forefront of that. And now they have over 100 locations. But yes, there are some groups that are, I would say spreadsheet over patient. But
Hmm.
we focus on working with the groups that are patient and doctor over spreadsheet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. This is one of the biggest things that we come up to. And so my thought is this is that what is your integrity worth? Right? If somebody's willing to give you $5 million, is it worthwhile to give away your integrity? I guess I would hope to say no, right? And if we think that that is the way that they are going to be handling doctors and patients going forward, and if they're going to affect the doctor-patient relationship, well, I would encourage you not to do a deal like that. You don't want to be able to have to get up in the morning and feel pressure to do things that you don't think are in the best interest of the patient, right? I feel like it's one of our obligations at this point to put the really good groups and the ones that are, doctor-centered, patient-focused, looking for great outcomes. I want to put them in a really competitive situation so they can fight against those groups that you're talking about, right? And I would love to see, the consolidation of dentistry go differently than the consolidation of medicine in total. And so I think one of the ways of doing that is by putting really great doctors with really great financial organizations that can support what they are, right? And if you do that, then suddenly you can compete against those groups that, yeah, they do get the benefits of scale, right? And they do get the benefits of a whole bunch of providers, all those different types of things. But right now, individual doctors are kind of playing against a stacked deck, right? Against these, what I would consider not so savory groups, right? So long story short is going to be, if you put yourself in a really competitive situation, not only do you end up getting, the best style offer, but you also get to see what the entire market ends up being. There's going to be different groups that you resonate with and different ones that you don't. And maybe that's for ethical reasons and maybe not, right? And maybe you just don't think you can get along with them, right? And if you don't get along with them, well, I don't want to work with somebody that I don't get along with every day. That'd be horrible, So anyway, I guess thinking through it in those terms, I think is really important, but it's the exact same way that I would be thinking about bringing on an individual partner to that practice, right? Do you like them? Do you trust them? Do you think they're going to be doing the right things, right? Do they have integrity and do they act on it, right? If they're doing those things, well, then maybe we're cooking with gas.
For sure. Yeah. The doctors assume, oh, they're going to come in and I'm just going to be an employee. Well, those aren't the groups we work with. We work with the groups where you're a partner, which means your name stays on the door. You get to continue to use the materials you want to use. They're not going to ask you to, overdiagnose, overtreat. You're going to get to be you. They are investing in you. You're the
Yeah.
product. So they want Smith Dentistry to continue to thrive as Smith Dentistry. As a matter of fact, most people that partner with a clinically agnostic group that we bring to the table, their referrals don't even know. That it's on that. The DSO exists in the background to help
Yep.
them grow.
Yep. All right. Maybe final question, then we'll wrap it up. So, are private equity firms interested in practices that meet all the qualifications? financially, but do 50% medical assistance. So I'm assuming what we're meaning is Medicaid there. And so, in answer to your question, yes, there are investor profiles that end up working with groups that do a fair amount of Medicaid as well. It does lower the total amount of the pool of buyers, right? And actually kind of dramatically. And the reason for that is going to be that the private equity learned during the hospitalization or hospital consolidation wave that once you have government pay within a practice, then suddenly that can be shut off, it can be turned on, it can be turned up, it can be turned down, all those different types of things, and it provides just variance, right? And so some groups are going to be okay with it and other groups are not, right? But we've had plenty of different transactions. As a matter of fact, we're doing a transaction right now where it's 98% Medicaid. That's an oral surgery group down in Florida. And so, yes, there can be a buyer for it, but it does limit those options some. Thank you all very much. Ty, it was a pleasure talking with you, and thanks again to Catapult. This was great.